printed out.
You can talk though, it's okay.
Yeah. I didn't print it out, so it's not in front of me.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, I should have,
Um,
I guess, but I didn't.
that's okay. Um, all right, so we will get started. And so for those who can't join us, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to post in the comment section of our Facebook group. But this is our week 1 review of the beginning of the C.S. Lewis Abolition of Man journey that we're going to take together over the next several weeks. I'm glad for the people who are able to join us, and then hopefully others will be able to watch this later. But I guess as we get started, let's just first begin in prayer, just so that we can kind of gather our hearts and minds and get prepared to kind of start to think more deeply about some things about life, and particularly morality and how God calls us to live. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Oh God, our Heavenly Father, thank you for the many blessings and gifts you've given us this day and every day. We ask for your forgiveness for all the ways that we have fallen short and failed to give you glory in everything we do in our life. We ask for the many intentions in our heart. We're all going through many difficult times and struggles and trials in various ways today. And many in the world are also struggling in various ways. So please help give us the strength and courage, give us greater strength and confidence in you, give us hope, give all the people in the world the wisdom to help all of us in these difficult times. And then we ask for all the intentions on everyone's, on the hearts of those who are listening and participating. And we pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Saint Joseph, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen. Let me see. All right, screen, share. Oops, let me jump up to the top. And I just threw this together a little bit just to kind of help keep me focused and along the way. But can y'all see the screen? It's black.
Yes, it's black. Yeah.
Okay. I didn't put a title. I ran out of time, but so the hope that I have for this is the Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. It's a really good book. I think many philosophers would say that it's one of his most important books, but it's not always one of the ones that is commonly read because it is a little more difficult. And I think that it's a great book for us to do as a group because we can walk through it and talk through it. There definitely are going to be times where you read something, you're like, don't know what he's trying to get at here. And that's why this group, I think, is important to kind of post those comments and say, hey, I'm on this section. I don't understand what he's trying to say. A couple times too, he's going to make references that we may not get because it's been since 1943 when this was done. And there may be things that are just not as forefront in our minds, or things that we may not be aware of. He'll make references to historical figures or philosophical figures. He'll talk about Plato. He sometimes throws an occasional Latin phrase in there that you're like, whoa, what is that? It's not often. And when he does throw these little references in or these allusions in, don't panic. And I'm going to help you along through those. I found an online resource that'll help some, and I'm going to post that later today. There's a book. If you want to look at my screen before, can you see my screen rather than not the black screen, but the picture of me? Let me stop sharing for a second. Here we go. So this book here, if you can see it, it's called After Humanity. It's posted, it was published just recently by the Word on Fire Press, and it's by a guy named Michael Ward. And I'm going to take some things from this. You don't necessarily have to purchase this book, although you can if you want. But he has a little introductory section, and then the majority of the book is referencing these different allusions or resources or references that he makes. So For example, I just opened this book randomly, and he says he explains a poem that C.S. Lewis makes an allusion to on, page 109 of the book. And so that'll be there, but I can definitely help you along the way by utilizing this resource. You can just put a post on the page, hey, what does this mean? And I'll try to help if I can. But I think for the most part, we can still grasp the book without worrying too much about some of these allusions and references that he makes. But we'll help along the way. All right, so now back to the main gist. And so as I've listened to different scholars and people talk about the book, they all said one good thing to do is to start with C.S. Lewis's essay, The Poison of Subjectivism, because they say it's a little bit easier than the book. It's brief, and it also gives you a foundation for what C.S. Lewis is going to be really the heart of the book. It gives you a little foundation for that. So I think it's a good opener for this week, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. And then we'll dive into the book and take the book very slow. As you'll find out, it's very short. I already had someone make a comment to me. They couldn't believe how short the book was, but this way we can take the chapter slowly, maybe about 2 weeks per chapter, something like that. And we can reread it and take time with it. Let me see. So I first want to introduce this essay and the topic of subjectivism that is going to be at the heart of what C.S. Lewis talks about with this phrase. And I posted it as one of our discussion questions for the week. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And the question is this true? Is this not true? What is this? It's a common phrase that we've all probably heard throughout our life. And there were many really good comments on the Facebook page about this. And so we have to ask ourselves, this comment seems to suggest that things like beauty are subjective, meaning that I myself, I'm the subject. And as the subject of the question, I define what beauty is. And so the question is reality utterly subjective? Is beauty utterly subjective? Is truth utterly subjective? Meaning that that's it. The only thing that makes beauty beauty is the individual beholder of it. And beauty may be different for all of us. But then there's the question, okay, the opposite extreme would be, well, is it merely objective? Is beauty merely objective? Is reality merely objective? Where it doesn't matter my opinion or perspectives, there's only one group of things that we would call beauty or beautiful. Or could there be an element of both? Could there be an objective dimension and a subjective dimension to reality? And so that's kind of the heart of the question. And what I would propose to you is that the answer is that it's both. That there is an objective dimension to truth, to beauty, to goodness, to reality. And then there's a subjective dimension to it. And this will be important as we think about morality as well, which is going to be at the heart of what C.S. Lewis has concerns with, is moral truth. But he also speaks to the big picture of reality too. But I propose to you this element of both. But the subjective dimension is going to refer to our values, our preferences, our life experience, our culture, our social influences, among many other things that impact our experience of life and our experience of reality. They're going to impact our consideration of things that we see as beautiful. So that's the subjective dimension. And this can change. We may have preferences for one thing when we're 10 years old and preferences for a different thing when we're 50 years old. And so these values and preferences may change over time, but this is part of the subjective dimension. And it's important. We can't neglect it or negate it, because we're human beings, we're subjects. We are people with values and preferences and life experiences. And these are important to us and to how we view the world, because we're not merely machines who just are programmed to live a certain way. So that's the subjective dimension is real and it's important. But we also cannot neglect the objective dimension. And this is where C.S. Lewis is going to have problems. It's because he sees developing in the world this emphasis on only the subjective dimension. And so subjectivism is going to be this idea that the only thing that matters is my subjective experience in this subjective dimension, that the only thing that matters with subjectivism is my values and preferences, that I get to define what is right and wrong, what is true, what is good. And that's the subjective element of that is the only thing that's true. And it's going to lead to things like relativism and other, there's other kind of things that branch off from subjectivism. So C.S. Lewis sees this growing in his time and culture, and is going to write about it because he is going to be very afraid of the dangers this proposes for the world. But what he's going to emphasize is there is also an objective dimension that is real and true that we cannot deny. So in regards to beauty, the way that I wanted to kind of emphasize this objective dimension of beauty is to look at Thomas Aquinas, just very briefly. I'm not going to harp on this too long, but when Thomas Aquinas is talking about God and he's trying to define the Trinity and to discuss some of the properties of the divine nature and who God is, he mentions beauty. And he defines what he believes beauty is, that he thinks beauty has three things, or that it should contain three things. It may only contain one of these three things, but these three things are important objective features of beauty. And so he proposed that one of the things that makes something beautiful is that it has integrity or perfection, which means like the closer something is to being perfect, the more beautiful it is. But things that are disordered, impaired, distorted, start to go the opposite direction. They start to lose that beauty and lose that integrity and perfection. And then he said the other thing that can make something beautiful is due proportion or harmony. So when you look at something or listen to something like music, the more harmonious it is, the more proportionate it is, that's going to give it features of beauty. And then he says a third element of beauty, an objective element, would be like the brightness or the clarity or the radiance of something, that could make something beautiful. And that he would propose these things are objective things that belong to our description of beauty. And so Aquinas said that for a thing is not beautiful because we love it, rather because it is beautiful and good, it is loved by us. For our will is not the cause of things, but it's moved by things. And so I can see C.S. Lewis's points in this quote, because C.S. Lewis is going to say, he's going to argue that there's this tendency to say that because something makes me feel good, it is therefore beautiful. And C.S. Lewis, like Aquinas, is going to say, no, it's beautiful objectively, therefore it makes us feel good or we love it. And so that there is this element of there's an objective dimension to what's beautiful. And then he's going to go on, Aquinas is going to go on to say that God himself is beauty. Just like we would say that God is goodness itself, God is also beauty itself. And that when we say things on earth here are beautiful, part of the material creation are beautiful, or part of this, or even the spiritual realm are beautiful, it's because they're participating in that beauty who is God. And that's going to be some deeper discussion of beauty that Aquinas will get into some. And then there's this author by this article that I read related to beauty, and he says that thus we are rightly drawn more intensely to those things that exhibit goodness and beauty in the highest degree. And since nothing exceeds God in goodness and beauty, God is necessarily the highest possible object of our love. Meaning, again, this idea that there's this objective element making something to be good and beautiful and true, and we're drawn to that. And the more good it is, the more beautiful it is, the more true it is, it draws us more deeply. So there is an element of objectiveness to these things. And again, that's not to discount the subjective dimension either. It's just saying there is an element of both. And to kind of describe that point a little bit more, so this picture of this garden with this waterfall, I think everybody would say that this is beautiful, that there are some beautiful features to this picture. And then you can look at this and say, yeah, that's not beautiful. There's an objective thing that is lacking in this pile of garbage. And so there is an objective element to what beauty is. And then this kind of contrast here between the beautiful garden and the pile of garbage helps to show there is something objective when we talk about beauty. And then I'm going to show you a couple of the pictures. This is that garden again. And then here's a mountainscape view with this lake. And then there's this beautiful church. Now we can look at these three things and say they're all is something beautiful about them. There's an objective dimension, but then we can have a subjective dimension because we can have our preferences. There may be one of these pictures that we find to be more beautiful than the other, but we may all disagree on what that is. But we'll agree on the objective level that there's something beautiful about these three pictures, but then we may have some disagreements and in our opinion because of our values and preferences or life experiences as to which one we find most attractive. And so that's trying to demonstrate this idea that beauty has both an objective and subjective dimension. But we're going to find that's true with a lot of things. And that's kind of what we're going to build on, is that C.S. Lewis is going to show us the problems with subjectivism, which means that things are merely subjective. And he's going to say this is very dangerous. It's going to cause many problems for our world if we don't try to counter that, or at least recognize that there is this mentality or this push for this subjective dimension to be the only thing that's true, and rejecting this objective dimension. And so that's going to hopefully get drawn out, but there are both, and we'll talk more about it.
Yeah.
All right. Questions, comments about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to, it has nothing to do with the main theme, but Aquinas's view of beauty, there's no doubt about those pictures are beautiful in that definition, that it has harmony, it has brightness, it has cohesion, blah, blah, blah. However, if you are educated in some of these things more than the basic, you can find beauty in non-realistic art, for example. You can find beauty in the balance and color of non-representative art. But you have to learn what is meant by it. You can look at it and say it's just a bunch of cubes with color and not see it. And it's the same with music. Yes, my own personal preference is harmony, but I have learned to listen to music from a very early age, and I can hear some things in what they call dissonant music. I mean, not my favorite, but there's something to be said for it as time goes on. I just wanted to mention that.
No, yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, because I did want to draw that out as well. That Aquinas's definition of beauty is he's doing that for a specific purpose. And I just emphasize it just to show that there can be a way to define it objectively. But I think, like you point out, Betty, is that it's also very important to study things, to understand what, truth and beauty and goodness and these things that are objective, because you can easily miss the objective elements if you don't have the education and awareness, like you're saying with art. It's a really good example, because there may be things that we may look at and subjectively be like, oh, I don't see how that's beautiful or pretty or good. What is that? That looks weird to me. But you have to study the art and what's behind the art and the features of the art to try to see the objective dimension to it, in some cases. So, and I think that's applicable to even truth and morality and everything else, that sometimes we let our opinions get in the way of fact and reality and the objective features of things. So I do think, like you said, it's really important to know that beauty comes in a lot of different ways, but there is going to be something foundational that makes something objectively in that category of beauty. And then there's something in that objective dimension that would make it in the category of not an example of beauty. And I use beauty just because it helps, because you can visualize it with these pictures here. But it would apply to same things with like truth and goodness and moral truth and things like that, which is where we'll build from this. But I think that's a really good point. It's important to be educated and to know and to study, because sometimes definitely our opinions can cloud things if we don't understand beyond that. Let me see, I think there was go ahead. Anyway, our other thoughts. Here's one quote, or that you're probably pretty common with the quote, "Don't confuse me with the facts. I've already made up my mind." So sometimes we let our opinions kind of get in the way, and that's going to be what C.S. Lewis is going to try to draw out, is we have to be really careful, because there is this tendency in the modern worldview of promoting these values and preferences and opinions, putting them, exalting them, and telling people that there is no objective reality. All right, other thoughts or comments so far? Okay, so the next thing I want to also talk about briefly is that I do think we have to be careful when we think about the objective dimension, because it does exist, that we also, building off kind of what Betty said, when you think of art, we have to also understand where people are coming from whenever we have conversations about the objective dimension and the subjective dimension of things. And so when we talk to people about moral truth or goodness or beauty or whatever it may be, we do have to realize that people do have different life experiences and different values and different cultural experiences and a lot of other things that make them view the world differently than us. And this does not mean, and by recognizing that subjective element to the world, it does not mean we're negating the objective dimension, but it means that we do sometimes have to put ourselves in other people's shoes sometimes and try to figure out why it is they're seeing the world in a particular way, and then helping to find common ground in the objective dimension and then building from that. So one of the things that I found just kind of I thought was fun, to kind of help to remind us that there are different perspectives in the world. So for example, like this little character thing here. So each person, from their perspective, is correct in what number this is written on the ground. To one guy it's 6 and to one guy it's 9, and they're correct from their perspective. But at the same time, that does not mean that the subjective dimension therefore makes them both right. What we need to do, and what we should tell these two people here in this picture to do, is to find out who drew the number and what number did they intend. Because there is an objective element. Whoever drew that number intended something. Did they intend the number 9 or did they intend the number 6? So there is an objective element here, but we can understand why these two people are having a different perspective and saying different numbers. And one of them is right. And so we want to help them to figure out which one's right, if that makes sense. So you want to sometimes dive deeper into to know what that objective truth is. You're going to have to dive deeper into the situation rather than just say, oh, well, my perspective, it's a 6 or it's a 9. You're wrong. I'm right, kind of thing. So we have to kind of dive deeper. And that's, I think, what the importance of recognizing there is an objective truth to things. But then recognizing the subjective dimension can be very influential, but we don't want to stop there with subjectivism, because subjectivism would say, yep, okay, both these guys are right. We just have to, tolerate both opinions. Their perspectives are equally valid, but that's not true, because there is something objective here. Similarly, so there is this famous like poem, I guess, about these blind men. And this image is depicting the blind man. So imagine you have 6 blind men. They come across an elephant, but they don't know what it is. No one has told them what it is. They're each standing at a different part of the element of the elephant. And so when they tell each other, hey, describe this object in front of us that you're feeling, you have the one guy in the back is saying, oh, it's this long, rubbery thing with this little hair at the end. It must be a rope. And then the guy on the top is saying, well, I'm feeling something that's soft and leathery, but it's moving and waving. It's cooling me off as it flaps in the air. It must be a fan. You have a guy in the front who says, well, no, this object is hard. It's sharp. It's pointy. It's long. It must be a spear. The other guy at the front, he's feeling the long, leathery trunk that's moving around. He says it must be a snake. So they're all having a different perspective of what this creature is in front of them. And they're all going to think the other person is crazy for describing the object differently. So the guy at the tail is not going to understand what the guy at the husk is saying at all, because he doesn't have that same perspective. And so it helps, this is to remind us there is, again, different perspectives that people have, that when they encounter the world, they may be encountering different aspects of the world, but we can't stop there and say, well, the subjective element's the only one that's true. We have to say, okay, yes, each of these guys has a different perspective. They're looking at this creature, or they're not looking, but touching and experiencing this creature at different parts of it. But then we have to keep diving, keep looking deeper, and tell these guys, okay, let's change places. Let's continue to examine this creature in front of us so that we can get it in its entire, experience this animal in its entire, all of its dimensions. And then they can eventually learn it's an elephant. So you don't want to stop and say, well, the only thing that matters is each person's individual experience of this animal. And that'd be the subjectivism error, is just saying, well, they're all right. But the philosophers would say, no, there is an objective truth here. We need to find it. We need to continue searching and diving and share our experience with each other. The guy at the tail, the guy at the top, the guy at the front should all combine their experiences to help them figure out what this creature is. So again, the subjectivism dimension, though, would say, well, each person's experiences are all that matters. And that's going to be true for them. We just stop there. And some people will use this analogy of the blind men to argue that there is no objective truth because everyone's experiencing the world differently. But what C.S. Lewis would say would be like, no, there is an objective truth, but we have to continue to help people see what that truth is by experiencing different elements of reality and helping these blind men experience different parts of the elephant. Now, y'all probably all seen this dress online, but so there's about 4 or 5 of us here. What color do you see? There's 2 different colors this dress is. What do you see?
Gold.
Say it again, Matthew.
Gold.
Gold and what?
And white.
Okay, anyone else?
Blue and black.
Okay.
Gold and white.
Okay. What does Jean say?
Gold and white.
Okay. Yeah, so this dress kind of has a huge, following on the internet because people see different things with it. Probably, I think the number was a little bit less than half see gold and white, and the other half sees black and blue. Like literally, that's what they see is black and blue. Like I see gold and white. I can't see black and blue at all. But my husband sees black and blue. And it's just the way that your brain takes in the information that it's given with the lighting and the effect of things. Your brain is taking in information and producing an image. And so just different people have different interpretations with their brain of this image. And so it's very fascinating how our brain works, that we do sometimes experience the world differently, but we don't stop there because you ask the question, well, what color is the dress really? And in real life, this dress is black and blue. It's just the lighting obscures it a little bit. And so some people's brain gets a little distorted in the colors, but the dress is black and blue. And my husband, to prove that to me, because I can't see black and blue, he even pulled it up on one of those graphic editing things. And you know how you can do that little dropper feature where it'll take the color and then drop it into another color. Anyway, the color program actually showed it was black and blue. So it's just the way my brain is interpreting the data before me. But if you go to the coloring programs, it's black and blue. All right, what about the shoe? What color is this shoe? There's two colors.
I see turquoise and gray. Jean sees turquoise and gray.
Okay, what else? Anyone else?
Pink and white.
All right, yeah, Betty, see, in my experience, the people who saw the black and blue dress see the pink and white here. Yeah. What about you, Matthew? You might be muted. I'm not sure.
Pink and white.
Okay, you do?
No.
Okay. You see pink and
pink
white?
and white.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. I see the teal and gray, but people do see pink and white. So the shoe is actually pink and white. This is the real shoe. But I can see the pink and white on the left, but it's because they changed the lighting a little bit. And so the real shoe is pink and white. It's just in the one on the right, some people see teal and gray, like I see teal and gray. But again, it's how your brain is taking in the light and the features and other things to produce an image. And so again, there is a subjective dimension to the world, but we also cannot allow that to make us negate the fact there is an objective reality as well. So we have to keep searching for that. I found this today. This is crazy. This also shows how our brain can trick us a little bit. So this image of this woman, does it look normal to you? Does her face look pretty normal? I mean, it's upside down, obviously, but kind of looks pretty normal to me when you first glance at it. But if you were to turn the image upside down, it's actually very distorted. And this is called the Thatcher effect. And it's something that our brains have a difficult time processing faces because we're used to looking at faces normally, not upside down. And so when the faces are upside down, it takes our brain a while to process there's something wrong with it. So at first glance, it looks normal. It's like this one. At first glance, it looks like a normal face. But then when you turn it right side up, it's not, because our brain has a hard time processing upside down faces. And then same thing here. These are two pictures of President Obama. Can you tell which one of the two is distorted? To me, they both look pretty good. They look pretty normal. There are some hints as to which one's distorted, but just quick glancing at it, it looks pretty normal. Our brain makes us think these are both pretty normal pictures of him, but only the one on the right is normal. The one on the left is distorted because our brain, again, has a hard time processing faces that are upside down. So it takes time for our brain to figure out something's wrong. I just thought these are all really cool examples of sometimes how our brain works and how our brain can sometimes trick us and into how we view the world and our perspectives. And I do this just because it's a little fun exercise, but also to remind us that we all do view the world differently and that there are things that influence our perspectives and our experiences in the world. And it's important. That subjective dimension is important, but we do have to know the limitations of that subjective experience of the world, and then continue to use that. And we value the subjective dimension, but it should never be to the negation of the objective dimension. And the objective dimension would take priority, but the objective dimension also cannot deny the subjective reality either. So that's kind of why I throw those examples in there. Okay. So I'm going to use that to lead into our essay. Any comments or thoughts at the moment before we jump into the essay? Okay. So if you have the essay in front of you, great. If not, that's okay. So this essay, The Poison of Subjectivism by C.S. Lewis. Pretty short, but it does give you the highlights, some of the highlights to the book Abolition of Man. So it's a good introductory thing to read. All right, in the very first paragraph, so he's going to say something is a false philosophy and that it can be a danger. But so why does he say false philosophy can be so dangerous? Anyone want to throw out the reason if you have it in front of you? He says false.
Greed and pride of men.
Okay, yeah. So anyone else have thoughts?
Well, immediately what I thought was because subjectivity is a lot more nuanced, and it's not as easy to see as those pictures that we've just seen. The upside down faces took a little longer, but probably given enough time, everybody will see it. But subjectivity has so ingrained and is so ingrained in our culture and educational system that we don't see it. We swallow it without realizing it's a bitter pill.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah.
that's where the danger is.
Okay, good. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said. And he also says too, like in this paragraph, that throughout history, and just because of who we are, we struggle with vices like greed and pride. We struggle with greed and pride. And he says, but the problem with false philosophy is that there's no check on our greed and on our pride. If we have like a good philosophy of life, if we like the objective morality, it kind of helps rein us in and checks us. It helps us to feel guilty when we do things that are wrong, for example. But if you have a false philosophy, then there's no boundaries. It's just going to continue to allow men to fall more and more astray in their life. There's no check on that greed and on that pride. And so he says, a quote in this paragraph is, correct thinking will not make good men of bad ones. So even if you have a good philosophy, it doesn't necessarily mean that that by itself will make bad men good. But he says that if you have an error in how you think, like this false philosophy, it removes any type of ordinary checks to evil and deprives good intentions of their support. So there's just not anything to give us boundaries of right living and wrong living, of what we need to flourish in life. There's no boundaries to help us stay within that healthy realm. And so these false philosophies are very dangerous because they just allow men to be led astray with no boundaries. And so this was written during World War II. A lot of his writings and Abolition of Man, particularly what we'll talk about, is written in 1943. And so during World War II, imagine the things that are going on with Nazis and with the different worldviews, the totalitarian states that are throughout the world. But he says that this philosophy that he's going to talk about is more of a threat than these totalitarian states. And this philosophy is subjectivism. He thinks it is more dangerous than these totalitarian states because he says that this false philosophy just goes so deep, and it's permeating the culture and permeating the way people live and permeating our lives, that it is going to be more of a threat to the world than the Nazis. And he's going to say in paragraph 2 that one of the things that he sees is that over the past several decades and centuries, man started to study his own reason, his own intellect, and he started to see it as merely just chemical and electrical events in the brain. And so now, instead of seeing reason as a beacon of truth, how does he see it? He says that, modern man now kind of starts to see that his reason is just a product of blind chance. It's not something that can lead us to truth. And therefore, reason, our intellect, is just subjective. There is no objective truth. Our reason can't show us objective truth. Our reason really can only show us, it only reflects our own values and preferences and life experiences. So it's just subjective. There's no way that our reason and using our reason can lead us to truth. And so he sees that this is starting to become a prevalent idea in the world, and it worries him.
Yes, it started with the Age of Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That the whole philosophy that being enlightened, in other words, I think at that stage, there wasn't much universal literacy. And so people who were educated came up with this idea that your reason can be expanded and you will become enlightened. And again, it's like, it's a very subtle thing and so easy to accept, especially at the age in which it was appeared.
Definitely. Definitely.
Well, I wonder what C.S. Lewis would say today, because, you know, in academia, it doesn't matter if it's grade school, high school, college, you see professors actually in biology actually saying that a man can become pregnant and have a baby. And if you object to that, you are a bigot. And I read a story about a teacher that stood up and said, I only believe there's two genders. She was actually fired because she was stating an objective truth. And I don't know how this has become so prevalent that we have gone so far that what has always been objectively true is now can actually be considered to be false.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly what C.S. Lewis was warning about in 1943. And that's why a lot of philosophers, like Peter Kraft, a Catholic philosopher, for example, he would say that C.S. Lewis was a prophet, that Abolition of Man is a very prophetic book because it predicts our state today. And so as we read Abolition of Man, you'll see where C.S. Lewis starts to get upset in the first chapter with this book that it's called the Green Book. We'll talk more about it next week, but or in in 2 weeks or whenever we have the next Zoom meeting, but he's going to talk about this book, and he starts to see how subjectivism is being kind of infiltrating the educational system and everything around us. And so the book's very prophetic because it does predict our world today in many ways, our culture today in many ways, is how subjectivism has become very, very dominant in our way of thinking. And almost an even bigger danger is that people don't see it, that people are blind to the fact that that's what's going on, and that the objective dimension has been ignored or rejected by many people. So definitely C.S. Lewis would have essentially been very upset, but he would have seen this coming. And that's why I think many people today think that Abolition of Man is probably the most important book that he wrote, because it does help us to see this danger that has developed, and hopefully helps us to start thinking and looking at the world differently so we can start to identify these issues like that.
Yeah, I'm sure if C.S. Lewis could speak to us today and see wokeism, he would say, I told you so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. He definitely would. And we'll talk about it along the way too, like what are, continuing to help us recognize it. And then as we go on, what can we do? One of the things in the next few paragraphs, 3 through 5, that he talks about very briefly is theoretical reason versus practical reason. I wanted to throw this out there just in case there was confusion about that, because he'll talk about how, sometimes subjectivism can infiltrate our theoretical reason, and sometimes it'll infiltrate our practical reason. Theoretical reason is this idea, because there's two ways that we learn things. We have theoretical knowledge and we have practical knowledge. Theoretical is essentially kind of knowing fundamental concepts and theories. This is kind of simplifying it, but basically just, fundamental concepts and theories. For example, you might know, I should say a bike, not a pike. So you know how to ride a bike, and mentally you can say, oh, yep, I'd get on it, I'd sit on it, try to keep my balance, turn the pedals, move the wheels, use the handlebars. I can have this theoretical idea of concepts of how to ride a bike. Practical knowledge is putting that knowledge of how to do something into action and knowing kind of how things work in the world. So practical knowledge is getting on the bike and figuring out how to ride it and learning how to balance and do the pedaling. It's kind of a type of knowledge that's not just abstract concepts and theories. And so he talks about how subjectivism can infiltrate both, but it's primarily affecting practical reason, how we view the world, and how the know-how of putting this knowledge to use of how we live in the world and experience it. But he says it affects both, but especially his emphasis is this practical reason. And that's where he talks about in paragraph 4. He feels like our judgment of good and evil, our judgment of right and wrong, that falls into this sphere of our practical intellect. And that's where subjectivism is really impactful and dangerous. That's kind of simplifying it, but hopefully I wanted to kind of make that comment in case that was a little confusing. But our knowledge of right and wrong is practical knowledge. And this realm of morality, what C.S. Lewis will say, it's objective, it's discovered, it's not invented. There are moral truths. There are things that we should never do. And there are things that are morally permissible. And then there's things that are morally impermissible. And so he would say that there are objective things to this, but subjectivists will deny this. But he says the reality is there is objectivity here. And so he starts to talk about that a little bit in paragraphs 3 through 5. And he says that the modern view is different. It rejects this traditional view of objective moral values. It rejects the traditional view that morality is discovered. The modern view, it's different because they'll say values they're not judgments, they're not objective, they're sentiments, they're attitudes. Values are relative, they change, they're man-made. We make them up based on our own preferences and experiences. Like essentially the modern view, the subjectivism view would be these values are based on my feelings. If I approve of it, then it's good. If I like it, then it's good. If I disapprove of it, it's bad. So if we say stealing is wrong, a subjectivist would say, well, you say it's wrong just because you disapprove of it. There's nothing objective about it being wrong. You just disapprove of it. Or with beauty, they would say beauty is always and only in the eye of the beholder. You say something's beautiful because it makes you feel good, or it makes you feel moved. But it's not that there's anything objectively beautiful. Or the same with truth. You say something's true simply because you approve of it. There's nothing objective there. So that's this subjectivism view that C.S. Lewis is going to challenge. And he says that men, subjectivists will say men create their own values and we create what is right and wrong. And then he continues in paragraph 5 about the modern view. And he basically, if this view is correct, he's writing during World War II. And so he says, if this view is correct, then how can we say that what the Germans are doing is wrong or that it's immoral? So he starts to challenge them, the Germans, the Japanese, and any of us, how are we even going to say that their ideology is right or wrong if we create our own values? If our values are basically based on our experiences, then it seems a little contradictory to say the Germans are wrong. Why can't the Germans just create their own values? And then they obey the values that they hold to be true. And then we can do the same thing and we may create different values, but why can't we just accept what they're doing as being okay because it's their own values? And then he will go on to say that if there's no objective morality, then we have no yardstick by which we can measure right and wrong, good and evil, moral or immoral. We can't say that something is better than another. And then in paragraph 6, this is where he kind of continues. He said, we'll hear people say, I want to be better, or I want the world to be a better place. He says, like, better than what? how can we measure goodness if there's no yardstick? If everything's subjective, how do we measure goodness? He has a problem when the subjectivists say, well, I want this to be better, because he just says that we need to challenge them on that and say, well, how can you even have this word better if we don't have a yardstick for what is true and what is truly good? And then he'll go on in paragraph 6 to say that, if modern man invents his own values and rejects the traditional view of morality, he has a problem with this. He says, the subjectivists will say, we must throw away these traditional values as they are irrational taboos. And he'll say, well, but based on what? Says who? If you're going to be a subjectivist and say that we get to create our own values, then why are you saying these values that are created are wrong? Now, we don't think they're created, we think they're discovered, but if we want to use their view of the world, then they're making a judgment that traditional values are wrong. So this is a self-refuting argument that they're using. And he says the subjectivists will claim that we need to throw away the traditional values because there's a more solid foundation on which we can base our values. And C.S. Lewis is like, what? He says, sometimes they'll say that this foundation, whenever we're creating our own values, a subjectivist realizes that if there are no values that we can agree on at all, it'll be chaos, it'll be anarchy, it'll be a horrible, chaotic world. There'd be no order. So they realize in order to have some sanity in the world and some order, to avoid chaos, to avoid anarchy, they recognize there has to be something that we agree on when we are starting to have people making values. And so C.S. Lewis will say that sometimes they'll say, well, this is in paragraph 6. Some people will say, well, we're going to determine what's good based on what is good for the community. And then he says, or sometimes they'll say, well, we'll determine what values are good based on what you would want someone to do to you, like do unto others as you would have them do to you. And then the third one he says they'll use is like, well, we can determine what's good because we have a duty to preserve our species. And so he'll say these are 3 common foundations that he hears people using on which to build their creation of values. But he says, but these are all judgments. If you're going to be a pure subjectivist, which they're promoting, why should anyone accept what you think to be good? Why should we care what's good for the community? Why should I care how I treat other people? Why should I care if we preserve our species? If we're going to be subjective, if subjectivism is true, then you can't even make these claims because these are your opinion. Would it be how a subjectivist would have to view it? C.S. Lewis is going to come back and say that this is a self-refuting argument by them saying that we get to create our own values, but we should do what's good for the community. That's kind of a self-refuting argument. And then C.S. Lewis will say in that same paragraph that ultimately the subjectivists are relying on traditional values because traditional morality says there is a common good. We do need to do what's good for the community, that this is a foundational moral principle. We do need to love our neighbor and treat them as we want to be treated. This is foundational, but it's a traditional objective moral value that's discovered, it's not invented. And so he says that modern man may try to reject this response by claiming, no, I'm not relying on traditional value, I'm relying on instinct. And so C.S. Lewis will say instinct. He says, do we have an instinct to love our neighbor or to act for the common good? Even if someone says we do, well, why should we obey our instincts? And which instincts are we supposed to obey? If you're going to claim that we know what values we need to hold based on instinct, well, I have an instinct to only eat chocolate chip cookies every day. I don't have any instinct to eat my green beans. So which instincts are we supposed to obey? Because not all instincts are good. But then if you're going to be a subjectivist about it, then how do you even define what instincts are good? Someone may have an instinct to go cheat on a test in order to pass. And so how do we know which instincts are good? If they're going to use that claim as being how we know to love our neighbor or to act for the common good, you can still come back with a response that's still ultimately basing your values on something deeper. And he's going to say that we know which instincts to obey because we know there's a standard. There is an objective standard by which we judge our instincts. And this objective traditional standard of objective morality helps us know which instincts to follow and which not.
Yeah, I'd like to share a little bit about my own experience in my 20s and 30s. I had some traditional values because I was a churchgoer, but I was immersed in subjectivism because it was all around. And I remember saying to myself that it was okay to be selfish as long as it didn't hurt anybody. And that was a very, very common subjective attitude during that time. And later, I realized I was hurting people right, left, and center by being selfish. But it sounded like a very good thing. And it's so subtle. And then, of course, I went into the late 60s into the 70s and the whole hippie movement of deciding to love everybody, which of course did not work at all. But the concept of exploring inner space. In other words, if you could explore everything that you hide from yourself, then you're going to be able to make better decisions for your life. It was a very hippie thing, that philosophy. And I followed it through, and I believe that God used it to bring me to a reality of, we'll keep it in this subject, of the reality of absolute truth and firm, absolute truthful traditions. Because I did learn a lot. It worked. I found out all those things that I was hiding from myself that was about myself. And then I didn't know what to do with it. There were no answers. Until I found the answer, the capital A.
Yeah, for sure. That's good. Thanks for those comments. Yeah, for sure. It's definitely it permeates the culture for sure. And one thing you could even say, like when you were saying that you would say, well, as long as I'm not hurting anyone else, I think C.S. Lewis would say to the subjectivist who said that, well, why do you even care about hurting anyone else? Why can't someone just go do whatever they want, even if it hurts someone else? Why does that even matter? Because if you're going to be a pure subjectivist about it, and someone in their own values just says, well, I don't care if I hurt anybody else. I'm going to just go and, drink and drive and not really care what happens to anybody else. Or I'm going to go and drive 100 miles an hour down the highway. I don't really care if I hurt anybody else. It's my value that I can do what I want. So I think C.S. Lewis would say that you can just continue to push the subjectivists, because ultimately there's going to be this foundation that they're building upon, whether they acknowledge it or not. And this foundation is going to be this objective dimension that exists, even though they want to continue to deny it and kind of remain blind to it. That's a lot about what Abolition of Man is about. It's going to be talking us through this process that C.S. Lewis will take us through of recognizing subjectivism and helping us to see some of the problems with it so that we can identify the problem and then help in counteracting it.
And the reason I never went that far is to say, who cares if I hurt people, is because my going to church, even though it was not the fullness of what I needed, did actually have values that I incorporated. In other words, I used that phrase to get around the fact that I didn't want to hurt anybody, but at the same time, I wanted to do what I wanted to do.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I think the subjectivist would probably say, well, you were just socially conditioned to accept certain values and reject others. But C.S. Lewis is going to talk about that. He will definitely talk about this rebuttal that, oh, we're just socially conditioned. It's not really something that's objective, but we'll get to that.
Okay.
All right. So continue with the essay around paragraph 7, he continues to talk about the problem with this idea that man can invent his own values. And he says that, trying to invent values is like creating a primary color in the spectrum of light. And he says one is just arbitrarily selecting one value from tradition, isolating it, and then making it the necessary foundation. And we've kind of already spoken to this, where they'll just take the common good, or they'll take love your neighbor. They'll arbitrarily select that as the one foundational value and then say everything else flows from that. But he says it's really just kind of arbitrary, and they still are using the subjective dimension, even though they deny it. And then in paragraph 8, he says that ultimately we either accept the traditional view of morality or else there's no values at all. We really can't have an in-between, because this notion of something in between existing just is a confusion of thought. Because he says that if you reject the traditional view, then there isn't this, oh, I'm going to arbitrarily pick certain values that everyone has to live by, because that's just this, that doesn't make sense, because there's either something objective or not. And so he says that if we reject the traditional view, then any value one claims to be foundational, like the common good, or like love your neighbor, or like just you can do whatever you want, just don't hurt someone else. Then C.S. Lewis would say, well, why should I acknowledge this as it being a good value? Why do I have to accept your determination of what's a good value? I just want to do what I personally think is good. So he says that really you're going to ultimately get down this slippery slope to really there being no values at all. So either he feels like there's an either traditional view of the traditional view of morality, or there's just going to be no values at all. And so he says that there's going to be a couple objections that the subjectivists may make. And so one of the objections that he speaks about in paragraphs 9 through 11 is that if we accept a universal and objective moral code, it's an obstacle to progress. And he's going to say, well, but doing something permanent like love doesn't mean there cannot be any progress. When you get married and you unite in love and it's permanent and lifelong, it does not mean that you can't grow in love. You will grow in love. So just because there is some permanent moral code does not mean there can be no progress. He says, essentially, I'm kind of taking what he says and kind of putting it in my own words, but he says that, does the fact that we accept that a triangle has 3 sides as universal truth create an obstacle to our progress in better understanding geometry? He was going to argue, no, just the fact that there's permanent truths does not mean that it's therefore an obstacle to progress. And he also says that if we don't have an agreed upon goal, an agreed upon destination, if this is changeable, how can we ever even make progress? So if we're subjectivists and there is no truth, there is no purpose to life, then that actually is the bigger obstacle to progress. Imagine getting in a boat and, we can't agree on where we're going. Someone wants to go to Ireland or Rome or India. We're never going to get to our goal because we can't agree on it. But if we can agree on a goal and how we get there, then we can make progress to the goal. So he says, really, this idea of subjectivism is the obstacle to progress, because we can never reach a destination. And then he says that if we do accept the traditional view of universal and objective morality, we can make progress, because he says there's a difference between moral advancement and moral innovation. Moral advancement is understanding things more deeply, or understanding the virtues more deeply, growing in virtues more deeply, whereas innovation is creating something that's radically new. He uses some examples in the paragraph about that, but he's just saying that you can make progress even with this objective morality. But what you can't do is create something radically opposed or radically new. The next objection he says subjectivists will claim is that they'll claim that traditional values are universal and objective. Subjectivists will say that, well, you claim the traditional values are universal and objective, but if you look across cultures and across time, they change. So since morality changes, this traditional view cannot be true. And C.S. Lewis will say, well, this is an erroneous claim. He says that you will find, if you go back in history, that various cultures always oppose murder and treachery and oppression, but they always uphold kindness and generosity and honesty. He says, now, sometimes there's blindness. Sometimes some cultures are blind to the truth of what's right and wrong, but you can still find in all these different cultures these objective truths that people can agree on. And in the very back of Abolition of Man, in the appendix, he's going to demonstrate that. He takes various cultures and shows where there are agreements on what is moral, what is right, and what's wrong. And he's going to try to show that this is not just a Christian thing. Across time and across cultures, there are areas where there is agreement, which would be a supporting feature to this argument that there is objective truth, objective morality. And then the third objective, he says a third objection that he hears actually from Christians against this idea of moral, universal moral code, is that he says that Christians may sometimes say, oh, go ahead.
Frozen there for a minute.
You were frozen.
Oh, sorry. Let me see. Check. Am I good now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So he says that one objection that he'll hear from Christians about this idea of a universal objective moral law is that they'll say, well, but doesn't this reject the doctrine of the fall of humanity? Isn't our reason and our ability to know the moral law completely depraved and completely evil and destroyed by the fall? How can we even know what's right and wrong because of the fall of humanity? And he'll say that the traditional view of an objective universal moral law does not reject the fall. And the doctrines related to the fall don't include that man's reason was so damaged that he cannot know the truth. And we know this even from scripture in Romans chapter 2, where Paul says even the Gentiles know the natural moral law. They know the law written on their heart of what's right and wrong in some cases. Now, there are certain foundational things we can agree on, but then as we start to discuss how things are applied and understanding moral truth deeper and deeper, that becomes harder to know without the help of the church and revelation and other things. But there are some foundational points that we can all know, whether you're Christian or not, whether you believe in God or not. And Paul kind of demonstrates that for us in Romans 2. And so C.S. Lewis would say this is not a valid objection from Christians. It's a misunderstanding of Christian teaching to make this claim. So he'll mention that in the essay. He says, our reason is darkened and we can make mistakes, but there's a difference between blindness, like not knowing something, and then imperfect sight, not seeing it very clearly. He says that we are not completely blind. Our vision is not completely blocked out and obscured completely from knowing the natural moral law. There is still some ability to know these things, but often it's impaired. And so he'll say that in the essay. He'll talk about that briefly. And then he says that the fourth objection from from Christians, if we can know the moral law, since it's objective and universal, then we must obey it. But we also have a duty to obey God as well. What is the relationship between God and the moral law? What is something morally right, good to do because God commands it, or does God command it because it's right? So this is kind of this argument has been going on for centuries. Basically, it's saying that do we have to say something is good simply because God tells us to do it? And the answer is no, because that is called like the divine command theory, where someone would even say that God could command you to do something. God could command you to hate him, and you would have to do it because God said so. And that's not the foundation of the moral law. The moral law is not simply good because God tells us to do it. But on the other hand, God does not command us to do certain things like the 10 Commandments because they're right. So that's the divine command theory. Then the second one is that if God commands them because they are good, this would make these laws kind of external to God. It would make God being kind of almost inferior, that there's this law that just exists and God has to follow it. Both of these are errors. This gets a little confusing. We can talk about it more later if we need to, but neither is really consistent with who God is, because God is goodness himself. And so he creates the world through his goodness and through his love. And these moral laws are a reflection of how he created us. And so what's right and wrong is based on who we are and who God created us to be. So like when a watchmaker makes a watch, it is good for the watch to tell time because that's what it was made to do. And so similarly with us, the way that God made us helps us to know the moral law. It's based on who God made us to be. It's not this external thing that exists out there that God has to be subordinate to. But at the same time, it's not just God commanding whatever he wants and we have to do it. The moral law is different than that. It's deeper than that, if that makes sense. So he kind of hints at that in this essay, which is a deep argument that's been going on for a while, and we can talk more if there's questions about it. But let me finish this little part and then we can come back to that if we need to. So God neither obeys a law that's external to him, nor does he simply create a law that he just commands it and we have to obey it. Goodness is not created. God is goodness itself. And the natural moral law is our participation in this divine goodness. And then modern man's going to disagree. They're going to say, well, good is whatever men are socially conditioned to approve of. And so there's people who, and what C.S. Lewis is going to continue to say is that this subjectivist view is not limited to one side of the aisle. If you think about worldviews or politics or whatever, people on all sides of worldviews and of politics and of religion fall into this error of subjectivism. And he says that what you'll see is that those who are subjectivists recognize there's a need for conditioners, and Abolition of Man is going to talk about this a lot. Conditioners are going to be those people who condition people into what is good, because subjectivism, because of how it is, you need people to manipulate and use propaganda, use education, use power to be able to get people to live and act a certain way, because you need the world to be ordered and not anarchy. We don't want tyranny and we don't want anarchy, but both are possible results if subjectivism has its way, because then people live however they want, do whatever they want. There's no order, there's nothing but chaos and anarchy. But so the conditioners will start to rise up because they become powerful, and they'll start to condition people into living certain ways and believing certain things and acting in certain ways through manipulation and propaganda. Abolition of Man is a lot about this, about how subjectivism ultimately is going to have conditioners and then those who are conditioned into accepting certain values as being good or true. And he's going to say if subjectivism is true, we can't flourish, without our society having some moral foundation. You're going to have anarchy or dictatorship if all we do is let people do what they want. It's going to be very divisive. And subjectivism is going to ultimately result in having conditioners and the conditioned if we let subjectivism have its way. I'm going to skip that part. Okay. And so this kind of leads us into the book, because Abolition of Man is going to go into this a lot more. We'll talk about it a lot more over the next several weeks, coming weeks and stuff. But that's kind of the gist of this essay. So I'm going to pause, and we have a few more minutes. I'll let you guys chime in or comment or say anything more about the essay. I'll say a few things about the book if we have time, but I want to use the last few minutes for you guys to ask questions or anything.
Well, I want to give other people a chance to talk.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Betty. I'm still trying to absorb it all.
Okay. Well, what I was just thinking lately is how journalism has been totally immersed in subjectivity to the point where you're saying it's more than propaganda. It's more than poor education. It is a consistent way to get people to believe what they believe. So it doesn't really matter what news program you look at or what newspaper you read, if anyone reads these days of the newspaper, you're going to get 100%. They're going to select the news that they present to you in order to propagate 100% of what they think is right. So even if you agree with the particular view that's shown, you have to remember that they're doing the same thing. They're editing what they show you, and media is so powerful these days. And for example, I am totally for working toward racial equality. However, there's one week in which 12 Black men were murdered. It doesn't matter how. And 25 white men were murdered. And you saw only the Black men in all the media, absolutely all the media. Only the Black murders were noticed in the news, even if it wasn't their main thing. Not anything was said about the white people who were murdered, because there is a view, and that view is being powerfully shown through our media, and we can't avoid it unless we, even though it might be very annoying, you have to look at both sides and make up your own mind. And you have to realize that you are ignorant to some things going on because they're edited out by people of power. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think subjectivism is very, very, very powerful today. And I think hopefully, I think that's why as we work through Abolition of Man, it'll even draw that out even more as to some of the things he predicted and some of the things that he talks about we need to be careful for. But you really have to say, okay, we all have different values and preferences and perspectives, which are important. Just like with the elephant or those two guys that saw that different number, 6 and 9, our values and preferences are important, but we also have to keep diving deeper and educate ourselves for that objective dimension. Go look and see what else is there, because we may not be hearing anything other than subjective views in education and media and things like that. Opinions are important, but it's not the end. That's not where we stop. We have to keep looking for the actual objective facts and then build from that. And I may do another thing soon too, because I had some questions about that, like how there are certain objective principles. So, from a Catholic perspective, for example, there are objective principles of solidarity, of the common good, of subsidiarity, of human dignity. These things are objectively good. Now, how do we live those out? How do we apply those to our life? There's going to be some subjective parts to that, but there are still going to be things that we cannot do. And there's going to be things that are contrary or that violate human dignity or that violate the common good or that violate solidarity. And so there's going to be these objective principles, and then how we live them out may vary a little bit. There may be situations, like I was talking to someone the other day who had a question about this, and there may be situations where I look at solidarity and the common good, for example, and I say, here are the options in front of me. I'm going to reject the ones that are immoral, but of the ones that are moral and possible for me to do, we may disagree on what are the best choices. So for example, we have a duty to educate and nurture our children, but how you exactly raise your children may vary a little bit. Or we have a duty to honor our parents. And so we have a duty to honor our parents, and a duty to our children. And sometimes those can come into conflict a little bit. Maybe I only have so much money, and my parents need it, my child needs it. How do we decide what's the right thing to do? So there can be different ways to apply these principles in our life. And we may have different values and preferences and experiences as to how we live those out, if that makes sense. And so there are a lot of different factors that come into play when we look at moral questions that we just can't discount. So we may talk about this more. We'll build off this more as we go along, and we can dive into it more, but it's something to kind of emphasize. All right, I think we probably just have a couple more minutes, and this thing might kick me off. I'm not sure how this works, but any other final comments?
They usually
Just put a face with you, Matthew.
Oh, yeah. Any other comments, questions?
They usually put a little thing up saying you only have a few minutes left.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. Yeah, well, what you just said opens up a whole new box of ideas, which I presume we're going to go into without enough time now. But of course, immediately what came to my mind was, yes, we all have these very, very difficult decisions to make. And that's why we listen to the Holy Spirit. That's why we don't say, I'll make up my mind based on my bank account alone. I'll make up my mind on praying and hearing what God has to say to me about it.
Yeah, I think there's we have to use a lot of resources available to help us know this objective dimension. So scripture, tradition, revelation, the church, the Holy Spirit, prayer, science. That's why the church says science and faith do not contradict at all. They work together, because there are things that science can teach us about who we are and about the world that are important. But science itself can also be prone to opinion and subjectivism and things like that too. So the way a scientist may interpret data, or the way a scientist may interpret the worldview that the scientist has, does bias what they do. So we can't ignore that either. Even as in medicine, like as a doctor, there's, you come into a relationship with a patient and you have your own worldview and moral views and values and preferences, and so does the patient, and they're different. And so we may come to different conclusions. And as long as what the patient asked me to do, and I think it's medically appropriate and it's moral, then, we work together on that decision. What I won't do is if a patient asks me to do something immoral. So if a patient asks me to help in like assisted suicide or something, that's immoral. So I can't do it, no matter what the patient values or preferences or what their view of the world is. And so and that kind of really tries to highlight that we may have different approaches to the world, but there's this objective view. Human life is sacred. I respect dignity. I respect the person. And there's that objective element. But then I talk to the patient. What are your values? What are your preferences? How can we help you flourish, but without doing anything that's objectively wrong? But yeah, we can definitely dive into that more as we go along too. Because I know I've kept y'all here a long time too. It actually didn't kick me off, so maybe it's going to let me go however long I want. But yeah, so I mean, I don't want to keep you guys on for too long either. But it looks like we could probably talk more if there are more questions.
I'm just gonna let you know, once you pay that fee, then you can have it as long as you want.
Oh, okay.
You set it for 1.5 hours. If you go over, it doesn't kick you off. It's only if you're on the free one, it kicks you off.
Oh, okay. Okay. So then we're good then. I want to be respectful of y'all's time too, though. So I don't want to keep y'all longer than you want, but if you have more comments or questions, we can definitely.
I'm sure I'll have more questions, and I'll post them on the Facebook.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of have to leave, but
Yeah.
I'd like to hear from Matthew. Do you want to talk about something?
No.
No. So
Thank you. Okay.
because it's like 2:30.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually have to eat something today.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah,
Thank you
I've
so
kept y'all a
much,
while. I kept y'all a
Thank
while, but yeah, if there's questions, like post them in the chat. Don't be afraid to say, hey, I don't get something, or hey, I'm confused. And then we'll keep walking people through this as we go along. And I'll post something soon too that gives a little brief introduction to our first week. And I'll post that video soon.
Okay.
This has been a great Zoom meeting. I wish more people would. You're recording, so I'm
Yeah, so hopefully they'll watch it.
encouraging more people to do it. And
All right.
I'm gonna leave now. Bye.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.